Poland is on the brink of becoming a superpower. When the Soviet Union fell in 1990, Poland was considered to be a write-off, having been one of Europe's poorest countries for the last century. Its position in Central Europe between Germany, Russia, and other European powers has unfortunately meant that it has been invaded numerous times, costing thousands of lives and significantly halting its progress. But this has all started to change. In the last 30 years, Poland's economy has grown more than tenfold, more than any other country in Europe. In this period, Poland has never had a recession. Whilst other countries fell in the 2008 financial crash, Poland just kept growing. This gives it the best track record of any country in Europe, and nearly the whole world. Its citizens, once some of Europe's poorest, are estimated by some measures to become richer than those in the UK by as soon as 2030. Poland's economy is not the only thing that's been growing. Keen to avoid any repeats of history, the country has spent the last 2 decades building its military, and it now has the largest army in the European Union. After joining NATO in 1999, it has been one of the few members to consistently meet and go beyond its defence spending requirements of 2%. Spending increased again in 2014 and 2022, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Poland proportionally is the biggest spender in NATO at 3.9% of GDP, the figure which is set to get even bigger. With a booming economy and a strong military, Polish citizens are far better off than they were 30 years ago, and life expectancy, average health, and educational attainment are all significantly higher than they were in the Soviet Union. Quite remarkably, Poland's growth has been based on brainpower, entrepreneurship, and hard work, as opposed to natural resources or financial aid, as we have seen with some other countries. However, what is perhaps more impressive is that they have avoided the traps of some other former Soviet states. When Russia and other nations were carved up after the Soviet Union, many state-owned enterprises were sold for pennies on the dollar, meaning wealth has been concentrated in the hands of a few very wealthy individuals. But not in Poland. The country has come out of its economic boom as an equal country, with a strong democracy and institutions to serve it for the future. So how did a country which has been poor for centuries suddenly prosper? This is the story of Poland. For many years, Poland was a bitterly poor nation. Its location in the heart of Central Europe has dictated much of its modern history, having been invaded multiple times by neighbouring powers Russia, Prussia, and Austria. By the end of the 18th century, Poland had been completely partitioned, disappearing from the map of Europe, only to re-emerge as an independent country after World War I in 1918. It remained a largely agrarian-based economy, relying on livestock and crop production. Despite several attempts to modernise, by the 1930s, Poland's economy remained underdeveloped compared to other European powers, making it extremely vulnerable and a large contributor to its rapid defeat in the early stages of World War II, thus beginning a 50-year period of occupation. Following the end of World War II, the country was in tatters, having served as a battleground for German and Russian forces. Poland now found itself absorbed within the Soviet Eastern Bloc, becoming a satellite state. In the 40 years that followed, similar to other satellite states, Poland was essentially used to service the Soviet Union, and its economy reflected this. Poland was run as a command economy, where the government controlled everything that was produced, as well as its price and its level of output. Independent businesses were pretty much non-existent, and the Polish leaders ran the economy based on whatever the Soviet Union leadership told it to do. This period was defined by deep isolationist policies, stagnation, and generally a poor quality of life for its citizens. Focus was placed on heavy industry to fuel the growth of the Soviet Union's many different aims. In Poland, some of its largest industries were in steel manufacturing and coal production. Whilst these produced some growth for the country, they often came at the expense of consumer goods. The demands of the population had very little influence over what was produced. This meant that items that were commonplace in the West, like refrigerators or televisions, were deemed to be a luxury in Poland, and people had incredibly limited access to items which could improve their circumstances. Cars were often subject to multiple year-long waiting lists, and there were often shortages of many basic food items, which sometimes had to be rationed. Throughout the 1980s, like many other satellite states, resistance against the Soviet occupation was growing, and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, Poland was in a similar position to many of these other nations. The country had been mismanaged for well over 40 years and was in desperate need of change. Many basic goods were hard to come by, and around 20% of the population were living in poverty. The collapse of a regime as large as the Soviet Union's created a lot of opportunity for many countries to now thrive. Whilst they had been poorly run for the best part of half a century, key industries had been established which would lay the foundations for economic prosperity. In the research for today's video, I've read lots of papers, articles, and even looked into a few books about the history and rise of Poland. The trouble is that a lot of these books on economics, geography, and history can sometimes be a bit long and complicated, which is where the sponsor of today's video, Shortform, can help. Shortform is a service which helps you find the most interesting books and articles and understand their key ideas in bite-sized pieces of content that take less than 20 minutes. They have thousands of books available, all with different levels of summaries. Whether you're looking for a one-page summary or a more detailed review of the key ideas, then Shortform has you covered. I use it every morning to look at topics like economics with Piketty's Capital, or to improve my online writing with the art of business and online writing. Shortform offers many more topics, from art to finance. And to get a free trial of unlimited access and an additional 20% discount on the annual subscription, join Shortform through the special link at shortform.com/The Invisible Hand, or click the link in the description. 1989 is where things start to change for Poland, off the back of some radical but effective policies by this man here. This is Leszek Balcerowicz. He was the head of finance in the first non-Soviet government and sought to transform Poland using the Balcerowicz Plan, a series of radical economic reforms labelled as shock therapy. You may recognise this term, as it's what Javier Milei in Argentina labelled his own set of radical economic reforms, and it's been used in other countries across the world with mixed results. In Poland, its main aims were simple: to change its economy from being state-controlled to a market-oriented economy. Keeping in line with the shock therapy, many large economic changes were made very quickly. Subsidies which had been provided for years to inefficient and costly industries like shipbuilding and mining were removed almost overnight, as were price controls on many products, which had kept goods artificially cheap. This sent the price of many basic goods spiralling, and the initial effect of this was brutal. The removal of subsidies meant that many state-run industries could no longer afford to employ their large workforce, and lots of people quickly lost their jobs. In the years following these reforms, unemployment spiked. Alongside this, people's day-to-day cost of basic items had also massively increased. In the 2 years that followed, Poland experienced a brief but severe period of hyperinflation. Coal used to heat homes was now 600% more expensive, and electricity 400% more than before. These changes, while sudden, were not entirely unjustified, and were part of a much larger vision for Poland. And after a sharp recession between 1990 and 1991, Poland started to grow again. Whilst Poland acted quickly in making many economic reforms, the shift towards privatization of these key state industries was much slower. This made corruption much harder, and is a large reason why Poland is one of the only former Soviet states that isn't dominated by oligarchs. The transition towards privatization was accompanied by the establishment of legal and institutional frameworks necessary for long-term economic growth. Property rights, commercial codes, and the re-establishment of the Warsaw Stock Exchange all served to create an environment that was conducive to business development. Entrepreneurship, which had been nearly impossible under Soviet rule, was now encouraged and allowed to thrive. Because of all these reforms, more and more businesses were set up, and the number of companies registered began to rapidly rise. Gone were the economies of shortage, and now many small and medium-sized businesses could be set up to produce a wide variety of goods and services that consumers wanted. Poland's economic boom also coincided nicely with the country's favourable demographics. In 1990, most of Poland's population were either already in the workforce or were due to come into the workforce in the next 10 years. Its large and cheap workforce, alongside its economic liberalisation to become a more efficient economy, made it the perfect destination for foreign direct investment. These flows quickly rose to around 5% of Poland's GDP by the end of the 1990s. Many companies, ranging from auto manufacturing to American tech giants, moved their operations to Poland to take advantage of its workforce. This allowed Poland to continue growing at a fast pace throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. And membership of the EU in 2004 further boosted Poland's growth. At the time, it was one of the EU's poorest members. Poland became the beneficiary of a flood of EU structural funds, in some sense the equivalent of the post-war reconstruction money that it missed out on because of the onset of the Cold War. Access to the EU single market also vastly improved Poland's trading opportunities. As a result of this growth and EU membership, GDP at purchasing power parity is now 80% of the EU average, compared to just 39% in 1990. Following this miracle period of economic growth, investment from foreign companies has continued to be a crucial source of growth for Poland, employing thousands of workers in key industries. But in many ways, this is a double-edged sword. The role of foreign investment has undoubtedly provided benefit by creating jobs and contributing to the skill development necessary for growth. However, Poland's booming economy has led many to believe it will fall victim to a problem known as the middle income trap. This is a situation where Poland's economy has become the beneficiary of lots of investment due to its large, cheap labour force. But as its economies continue to grow, workers will be paid more and more, gradually eroding its price-competitive labour advantage and therefore making it a less attractive place to invest. For Poland, this becomes an issue. 40% of Polish industries are owned by foreigners, and it has not yet established many major companies domestically which can provide the same level of employment and development opportunities as multinationals. Thus, it will be caught in the middle income status, as it's heavily reliant on relatively cheap labour to keep up the flows of foreign investment. It still remains unclear how Poland will continue from this point. On the one hand, it doesn't have many large domestic companies to provide growth. But on the other hand, Poland has developed an increasingly educated workforce, serving as a hub for engineering graduates, whilst also being one of the hardest working countries within Europe, with levels of productivity higher than France, Germany, and even the United States. Economic theory would suggest that over time, this would lead to the development of more Polish-owned businesses to propel the country forward, but this is something which is still not fully materialised. Either way, foreign investment is still likely to keep flowing to Poland for many years to come, both due to its increasing trend of nearshoring and its extremely productive workforce. Poland has not been solely focused on its economy, and has also committed large amounts of money to quickly build its military, pushing it towards superpower status. Since joining NATO in 1999, Poland has prioritised strengthening its military capabilities, modernising its armed forces and forming strategic alliances with the United States and South Korea for arms provisions, purchasing supplies of tanks, fighter jets, and other advanced military equipment hand over fist. This isn't just blind paranoia, and Poland has good reason to be concerned. Given its central location and its previous history, the country is more aware than most of the threat of foreign military movements. Poland has consistently been one of the highest military spenders in NATO. But following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this was again revised upwards, as they look to spend an estimated 5% of their GDP on defence within a few years, and continue to grow their military to become the most advanced and powerful in Europe. Given all the optimism within Europe about the future of Poland as a new global superpower, it's worth noting that there are still some potential threats to the country that could block its rise. Like many other European nations, there are concerns around the country's demographics. Not just its gradually ageing population, but also the outflow of skilled workers to other European countries. Brain drain has been a real issue for Poland, and in the last 2 decades, millions of their most talented workers have left the country to seek employment in wealthier nations, depriving their own economy. However, we have seen signs that this trend is starting to reverse, as thousands of Polish nationals are coming back every year to work, and set up their lives back home to take advantage of the growing job opportunities, testament to the country's successful development. What is perhaps more of a risk is the threat that Poland will still remain a middle-income country, facing all the challenges that go with it. Whilst new technology centres and jobs are being created every year within Poland, these are usually funded by large multinational corporations from abroad. Low spending on research and development, around 1.5%, has meant that very few large Polish companies exist, and the nation is still reliant on these foreign giants as sources of employment. A highly educated workforce like Poland's would suggest that over time more and more companies would be founded, creating jobs and domestic growth, but this still isn't the case. Only one company in the Fortune 500 is Polish, compared to 30 German companies and 18 British ones. This is an issue which will only get worse for Poland, and they become more and more reliant on foreign investment to drive their growth. This is further made worse as Poland has one of the lowest saving rates in the European Union. This is an issue as household saving is one of the primary drivers of domestic investment and capital development. Higher levels of saving often leads to higher levels of domestic investment, which would mean that Poland can become less reliant on foreign capital to plug this mismatch. Poland's path to becoming a true economic superpower, while certainly in a better position than it was 30 years ago, still faces a number of challenges. Its ability to develop domestic growth and push past the status of a middle-income nation will perhaps be the most important factor in determining its success. But the threat of Russian aggression from the east, as well as its own domestic political troubles, could also spell challenges for the country. If you've liked this video and would like to watch more, then make sure to check out our videos on other European economies, like France, the UK, Ireland, and many more.